The registered letter from my great-aunt's estate attorney arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, I owned the land underneath one of Arizona's most exclusive gated communities. My name is James Irvington, and I'm a commercial real estate appraiser from Flagstaff. I'd never been particularly close to Aunt Margaret, my grandfather's sister, but apparently she'd been following my career more closely than I realized. When she passed at 97, her attorney contacted me with news that made my jaw drop. In 1925, Margaret's father, my great-grandfather, had leased 40 acres of desert land outside Scottsdale to a development company for 99 years. The lease expired on June 1, 2024, and now, through Margaret's will, I owned the ground beneath Sunset Ridge Estates, a community of 200 homes worth anywhere from $800,000 to $2 million each. I sat in the attorney's Phoenix office, staring at the yellowed lease document preserved in a plastic sleeve. The terms were crystal clear. The Sunset Ridge Development Corporation had paid $10,000 in 1925 for a 99-year lease. They'd built their gated community, established their homeowners association, and apparently forgotten that the ground beneath their million-dollar mansions wasn't actually theirs. "This can't be right," I said, reading the document for the third time. Someone would have noticed. They would have renewed the lease or bought the land outright. Attorney Richard Chen adjusted his glasses and pulled out a thick folder. "You'd think so, but here's what happened. The original development company went bankrupt in 1931. The assets were purchased by another firm, which was acquired by a third company in 1968. That company dissolved in 1994. Each transfer of ownership apparently failed to flag the lease's expiration date. The HOA incorporated separately in 1982 and has been operating under the assumption they owned the land in perpetuity." So what does this mean legally? It means you own the land. The lease expired 2 months ago. Technically, everything built on your property belongs to you, though we'd likely face litigation over the structures themselves. What you definitely own, without question, is the ground. You have options. You could offer to sell it to the HOA. You could negotiate a new lease. Or, he paused meaningfully, or what? Or you could exercise your rights as the landowner, but I'd recommend the first two options. Things could get complicated otherwise. I drove out to Scottsdale that afternoon, punching the address into my GPS. The community sat in the desert northeast of the city, backed up against the McDowell Mountains. The entrance featured a guardhouse with a red tile roof, massive stone pillars, and an ornate iron gate with Sunset Ridge Estates spelled out in bronze letters. I pulled up to the gate and a security guard stepped out. He was in his 60s, wearing a crisp uniform that looked more appropriate for a 5-star hotel than a neighborhood entrance. "Good afternoon, sir. Who are you here to visit?" "Actually, I'm the new landowner. I'd like to take a look around." His friendly expression froze. "I'm sorry, what?" "I own the property. All 40 acres. The lease expired." I pulled out the documentation the attorney had given me. He barely glanced at it. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around. If you have business with the HOA, you need to schedule an appointment with the board. I don't need an appointment to inspect my own property. Sir, I'm asking you to leave." This was going nowhere. I put the car in reverse and backed out, but I'd seen enough. Beyond the gate, perfectly manicured streets wound between massive homes in various shades of beige and terracotta. Palm trees lined the boulevards. In the distance, I could see a clubhouse with what looked like tennis courts and a pool. Back at my hotel, I called Richard Chen. "They won't let me on the property. Technically, they're trespassing by preventing the landowner from accessing his land. But let's not escalate yet. I'll draft a formal notice to the HOA board, informing them of the situation. That should get their attention." It took less than 48 hours. On Saturday morning, my phone rang from an unknown Scottsdale number. "Is this James Irvington?" a woman's voice asked, tight with barely controlled anger. "Speaking. This is Patricia Moreland, president of the Sunset Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I've received the most ridiculous letter from an attorney claiming you own our community. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but it's not a scam, Mrs. Moreland. I have the original lease documents. Your development company leased the land for 99 years, starting in 1925. That lease expired on June 1st. That's absurd. We own this land. We've owned it for decades. No, madam, you don't. I'd be happy to meet with your board to discuss options, but the legal reality is clear. I own the ground beneath your community. There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from angry to coldly professional. The board will meet on Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. I expect you to be there with your attorney and all relevant documentation. We'll be there. Tuesday evening, Richard and I arrived at the gate at 6:45. This time, we were expected. The guard waved us through without comment, and I got my first real look at Sunset Ridge Estates. The homes were even more impressive up close, sprawling ranch-style mansions with 3 car garages, desert landscaping that must have cost a fortune to maintain, and views of the mountains that would take your breath away. The clubhouse sat at the community center, a Pueblo-style building with a parking lot full of Mercedes, BMWs, and Teslas. Inside, we were directed to a conference room where 5 people sat on one side of a long table. Patricia Moreland was exactly what I'd expected, a woman in her mid-50s with blonde highlights, expensive jewelry, and an expression that suggested she'd just tasted something unpleasant. The other board members ranged from a stern-looking man in his 70s to a nervous woman who kept glancing at the documents spread before them. "Mr. Irvington," Patricia said, not offering to shake hands. "Please sit. You've caused quite a disruption to our community." "I didn't cause anything," I replied evenly. "I inherited property that was legally leased decades before any of you lived here." "Our attorney has reviewed the documents you provided," said the older man, who introduced himself as Gerald Hutchins, the HOA treasurer. "While the lease appears authentic, we have serious questions about its validity in modern context. No one has claimed ownership of this land in 99 years. Richard Chen opened his briefcase. "Lack of claim doesn't invalidate ownership. Mr. Irvington's great-grandfather owned the land. It passed through his family. The lease was honored for its full term. Now it's expired. This is straightforward property law." Patricia leaned forward. "What do you want? Money? Is this some kind of shakedown?" "I want to reach a fair agreement," I said. "I understand this situation is complicated. I'm willing to discuss selling the land to the HOA or establishing a new lease with reasonable terms." "Reasonable," Patricia repeated. "And what does reasonable mean to you?" "Fair market value if we're talking about a sale. If we're discussing a lease, something that reflects the current value of the property while acknowledging the existing development." Gerald pulled out a calculator. "Do you have any idea what 40 acres of developed land in this location is worth? We're talking about tens of millions of dollars. This HOA doesn't have that kind of capital." "Then maybe a lease makes more sense," Richard suggested. "We could structure something with annual payments." The board members looked at each other. The nervous woman, introduced as Susan Crawford, spoke up. "How much time do we have to figure this out?" "I'm not trying to rush anyone," I said. "But legally, as of June 1st, you're occupying my land without authorization. I'd like to formalize an arrangement soon." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. Look, I understand this is shocking. I was shocked too. But we need to work together to find a solution." The meeting ended with an agreement that both sides would have their attorneys draft proposals for either a sale or a new lease. We'd reconvene in 2 weeks. I thought we'd made progress. I was wrong. The following Monday, I received a certified letter from Blackwell & Associates, a Phoenix law firm representing the HOA. They were suing me for attempted fraud, extortion, and making false claims to property ownership. The complaint was 23 pages of legal arguments suggesting that the lease had been automatically renewed, that my great-grandfather had abandoned his claim, and that the HOA had established ownership through adverse possession. I called Richard immediately. "Can they do this?" "They can file whatever they want. Winning is another matter. Adverse possession requires open and notorious use without the owner's permission. But your family was receiving annual lease payments until 1931 when the original development company went bankrupt. That defeats their claim. As for automatic renewal, there's no clause in the lease providing for that. This is a nuisance suit, probably meant to intimidate you or delay any resolution. So what do? We file a countersuit for declaratory judgment, confirming your ownership, And we send them a formal notice that as of today, they're operating on your land without a lease agreement. You're entitled to compensation for that use. How much compensation? Well, let's see. Fair market rental value for 40 acres of prime Scottsdale real estate, currently developed with 200 homes and community amenities. I'd estimate at least $50,000 per month. Probably more. I nearly dropped the phone. $50,000 a month? That's conservative. You could argue for more. The lawsuit turned everything hostile. The HOA stopped responding to my attempts to negotiate. Instead, Patricia Moreland started a campaign within the community, sending emails to all residents warning them about the scam artist trying to steal their homes. I started getting angry calls and emails from homeowners who'd never heard about the lease situation until Patricia framed it as an attack on their property. One message stood out. It came from a woman named Eleanor Fairchild, and unlike the others, it wasn't angry. Mr. Irvington, my name is Eleanor, and I've lived in Sunset Ridge for 15 years. I'm an attorney, though I'm currently retired. I've been doing some research into your claim and the HOA's response. I'd like to speak with you if you're willing. I think there are things happening here you should know about. I called her that evening. She had a warm voice with a hint of an East Coast accent. Thank you for calling back, she said. I want to be upfront. I live here, so technically the HOA represents my interests. But I'm also an attorney who specialized in property law for 30 years, and what Patricia and the board are doing is both legally questionable and ethically disturbing. I'm listening. The board held an emergency meeting last week. They didn't properly notify all homeowners, which violates our own bylaws. During that meeting, they voted to use HOA reserve funds to fight you in court. We're talking about nearly $2 million set aside for community maintenance and emergencies. Patricia convinced the board that if you win, everyone's property values will collapse. That's not true. I just want a fair arrangement. I know. I've read the lease documents that were included in the court filings. Your claim is solid. But here's the problem. Patricia doesn't care about what's legal or fair. She cares about control. She's been HOA president for 8 years, and she runs this community like a personal fiefdom. People are afraid to cross her because she'll fine them, sue them, or make their lives miserable. So what are you suggesting? Document everything. Patricia has a history of, let's say, creative interpretations of the rules when it suits her. I suspect she's going to escalate this situation in ways that could backfire on her. When she does, you'll want evidence. Eleanor's warning proved prescient. 2 days later, I drove out to Scottsdale to meet with a surveyor I'd hired to formally map the property boundaries. When we arrived at the gate, a different security guard stopped us. I'm sorry, sir. You're on the banned list. I can't let you enter. Banned? This is my property. You can't ban me from my own land. I have my orders, sir. You need to leave. The surveyor, a weathered man named Tom who'd been doing this work for 20 years, shook his head. This is a new one. I've never been blocked from accessing property by people who don't own it. I called Richard from the car. Within an hour, we had an emergency hearing scheduled with the judge. By Friday afternoon, I had a court order granting me access to the property for the purpose of surveying and inspection. When I returned on Monday with the court order, the guard read it carefully, made a phone call, and reluctantly opened the gate. Mrs. Moreland wants you to know that you're only allowed on common areas, not private streets, he said. The entire property is mine, including the streets, I replied, but we'll stick to what we need for the survey. As Tom and his team set up their equipment, I noticed curtains twitching in nearby homes. A few residents came out to watch, keeping their distance. One man, probably in his 40s, approached carefully. Are you really going to take our homes? He asked. He looked scared. No, I said firmly. I'm not trying to take anyone's home. I'm trying to establish a fair lease agreement with the HOA. The problem is, they're more interested in fighting than negotiating. Patricia sent an email saying you want to charge everyone $50,000. I could feel my frustration building. That's not what's happening. The HOA as an organization would pay for a lease, just like the original development company did. It would come out of HOA fees, which might go up some, but no one's losing their home. He looked uncertain, but nodded. Okay, thanks. The emails we've been getting made it sound like we'd all be evicted. After he left, I understood Patricia's strategy. She was creating panic among the homeowners, making me the villain, and using that fear to justify her legal campaign and her use of HOA funds. It was manipulative and dishonest, but apparently effective. The survey took 3 days. Tom's team confirmed what the original documents showed. The 40 acres included every home, every street, the clubhouse, the pools, the tennis courts, and even the guardhouse. When I received the final report, Tom added a personal note. "In 20 years, I've never seen anything quite like this. You've got a solid claim to some of the most valuable residential land in Scottsdale, but I've also never seen an HOA fight this dirty. Watch your back." In August, Richard filed our countersuit and a formal demand for back rent dating from June 1st. We calculated fair market rental value at $65,000 per month, meaning the HOA owed me over $130,000 for June and July alone, with the meter running. The HOA's response was to file an emergency motion claiming financial hardship and requesting that the court place a stay on any rent payments pending resolution of the ownership dispute. They also filed a complaint with the Arizona Real Estate Department, claiming I was operating as an unlicensed property manager, and reported me to the IRS, suggesting I was evading taxes on rental income. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," Richard said. "None of these complaints will go anywhere, but they're designed to harass you and drain your resources. How are you doing financially? This kind of litigation can get expensive." "I'm okay for now," I said. "I've got some savings and my business is doing well, but I can't sustain a multi-year court battle." "I don't think it'll come to that. Their case is weak. The problem is they've got $2 million in reserves and a board president who's treating this like a holy war. We need to change the dynamic." Eleanor Fairchild called me again in September. "There's going to be an HOA meeting next week, annual budget review. By law, it has to be open to all homeowners. You're not a homeowner, but you are the landowner. I think you should attend." "Will they let me in?" "They have to. It's in the Arizona HOA statutes. Any affected party can attend open meetings. If Patricia tries to exclude you, she's violating state law." The meeting was held on a Thursday evening at the clubhouse. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a seat in the back of a room set up with about 100 chairs. Residents trickled in, many of them doing double takes when they recognized me. The whispered conversations were intense. Patricia entered exactly at 7 p.m., flanked by the other board members. She was mid-sentence when she spotted me, and her face went rigid. "What's he doing here?" she demanded, pointing at me. I stood up. Arizona Revised Statute 33, 1804 provides that HOA meetings must be open to members and any parties with a material interest in the matters being discussed. As the landowner, I have a material interest. You are not welcome in this community. I'm not leaving. If you want to have me removed, call the police and explain to them why you're violating state law." Eleanor spoke up from the middle of the room. "He's right, Patricia. The statute is clear. He has a right to be here." Patricia's jaw clenched, but she said nothing more. The meeting proceeded with the usual mundane HOA, business landscape contracts, pool maintenance schedules, gate repair costs. Then they reached the budget discussion. Gerald Hutchins presented the proposed budget for the next fiscal year. Everything looked normal until he reached a line item labeled Legal Defense Fund, $2 million. A man near the front raised his hand. "Gerald, that's our entire reserve fund. What happens if we have an emergency? What if the roads need repaving or we have structural issues with the clubhouse?" "This is an emergency," Patricia interjected. "We're fighting for the survival of this community. If we lose to Mr. Irvington, your property values will plummet. Your homes could be worthless." I couldn't stay silent. "That's not true. I've offered repeatedly to negotiate a fair lease or sale. The only thing threatening this community is the board's refusal to engage in good faith discussions." "You have no right to speak at this meeting," Patricia snapped. "Actually, under the same statute, I do. Any party at an open meeting can address the board during designated comment periods." Eleanor stood up. "I'd like to make a motion that the board enters mediation with Mr. Irvington before spending any more reserve funds on litigation." "Motion denied," Patricia said immediately. You can't just deny a motion, another homeowner called out. It has to be seconded and voted on. I second the motion, said the man who'd asked about the budget. Patricia looked furious, but she was trapped. Fine. All in favor of wasting our time on mediation? Hands went up throughout the room. I counted quickly. It looked like at least 60% of the attendees. This is an advisory vote only, Patricia said. The board makes the final decisions. And we elect the board, Eleanor replied. I'm calling for a special election to recall the current board and install members who will act in the best interests of this community, not their own egos. The room erupted. Some people applauded. Others shouted objections. Patricia pounded a gavel on the table, demanding order. It took 10 minutes to restore calm. By the end of the meeting, Eleanor had gathered enough signatures to force a recall election under the HOA's bylaws. It would take place in 6 weeks. For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt like maybe, possibly, there was a path forward. Patricia didn't take the challenge lying down. Over the next week, she sent multiple emails to residents attacking Eleanor as a traitor and a puppet of my land grab scheme. She accused me of bribing Eleanor, of planning to bulldoze the community, and of having ties to shady developers who would turn Sunset Ridge into high-density apartments. None of it was true, but truth didn't seem to matter. The community was splitting into factions. Some residents, particularly those who'd lived there longest and had the most equity in their homes, supported Patricia out of fear. Others, especially younger homeowners and those who'd actually researched the situation, sided with Eleanor. The nastiness escalated. Eleanor's tires were slashed in the clubhouse parking lot. Someone spray-painted "traitor" on her garage door. When she reported it to the police, they took a report but said without witnesses or cameras, there was little they could do. I was having my own problems. Someone filed a false complaint with my professional licensing board claiming I'd falsified property appraisals. It was baseless, but I had to spend hours compiling documentation to refute it. My business phone was bombarded with 1-star reviews on Google from accounts that had never used my services. The reviews all said variations of "scam artist" and "trying to steal homes from senior citizens." "This is coordinated harassment," Richard said. "We could pursue claims for defamation and tortious interference with business relations. But that's another lawsuit. More time, more money." "I just want this resolved," I said. "Is there any way to force the HOA to the negotiating table?" "The recall election might do it. If Eleanor's slate wins, the new board could vote to settle, but that's still weeks away, and Patricia's going to fight tooth and nail." The weekend before the election, I got a call from Eleanor. She sounded shaken. "James, I need to tell you something. I received a letter today from the HOA's attorneys. They're threatening to fine me $50,000 for violating community covenants." "What covenant?" "They claim I'm conducting business out of my home by advising you on legal matters. It's absurd. I'm retired. I'm not billing you for anything. We've just talked on the phone." "Can they do that?" "Not legally, no, but they can make the claim and I'd have to fight it. At my age, with my health," she paused. "I have heart issues, James. My doctor has been warning me about stress. I can't keep doing this." My stomach sank. "Eleanor, please don't drop out of the election. These people need someone to stand up to Patricia." "I'm not dropping out. But I'm tired and I'm scared. Someone left a dead bird on my doorstep this morning with a note that said, 'Quit while you can.'" "That's a threat. You need to call the police." "I did. They took another report. But James, this community has security cameras at the gate and along some of the main streets. The HOA controls the security company. If Patricia wanted to find out who's doing this, she could pull the footage. The fact that she hasn't tells me everything I need to know." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment in Flagstaff, staring at the wall. This had spiraled so far beyond a property dispute. People were being harassed, threatened, and intimidated. The HOA was using reserve funds meant for community maintenance to wage legal warfare. And at the center of it all was Patricia Moreland, who'd rather burn everything down than admit she was wrong. I made a decision. I called Richard. "I want to file a formal complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office. HOA abuse, misuse of funds, harassment, all of it. And I want to report the threats against Eleanor to the FBI. Tampering with an election, Even an HOA election could be a federal crime if it involves interstate communications, right? It's a stretch, but yes, if any of the threatening messages came through email, or if the online harassment crossed state lines, there could be federal jurisdiction. Are you sure you want to escalate this far? I'm sure. This isn't about money anymore. Patricia and her board are running a criminal enterprise disguised as an HOA. Someone needs to stop them. We filed the complaints on Monday. By Wednesday, I received a call from an investigator with the Arizona Attorney General's office. Her name was Detective Maria Santos, and she specialized in HOA fraud cases. Mr. Irvington, I've reviewed your complaint and the supporting documentation. I have to say, this is one of the more egregious cases I've seen. The misuse of reserve funds alone is a serious violation. The harassment and intimidation takes it to another level. I'd like to open a formal investigation. What does that involve? I'll need to interview witnesses, review HOA financial records, and examine correspondence between board members. I'll also coordinate with local police on the harassment complaints. This will take time, but I want you to know we take these cases seriously. The investigation became public knowledge within days. Patricia sent an email to all residents claiming the Attorney General's investigation was retaliatory harassment coordinated by James Irvington and his co-conspirators. She urged homeowners not to cooperate with investigators and to direct all inquiries to the HOA's attorneys. The recall election took place on a Saturday in late October. Eleanor's slate won by a margin of 62%. 3 new board members were installed. Eleanor as president, a retired accountant named Marcus Webb as treasurer, and a former teacher named Linda Kovach as secretary. Patricia, Gerald, and Susan were out. The new board's first action was to call an emergency meeting. They invited me and Richard to attend. Mr. Irvington, Eleanor said, looking exhausted but determined, on behalf of the new board, I want to apologize for how you've been treated. We've reviewed all the documentation, and it's clear your claim to the land is legitimate. We'd like to discuss settlement options. Over the next 2 hours, we worked out the framework for an agreement. The HOA would purchase the land for $18 million to be paid over 10 years with 4% interest. The total cost would come out to roughly $23 million after interest, which meant each of the 200 homeowners would pay an additional $1,000 per month in HOA fees for the next decade. It's not ideal, Marcus said, looking at the numbers, but it's fair. It protects the homeowner's property values and gives you appropriate compensation for the land. The alternative is years of litigation that could cost more and leave everyone worse off. I agree, I said. Let's do it. The agreement was drafted over the next 2 weeks and presented to the full HOA membership at a special meeting in November. The vote was close, 112 in favor, 88 against. The opposition, led by former board members still loyal to Patricia, argued that the settlement was too expensive and that the HOA should continue fighting in court. But the majority recognized reality. The land was mine. The lease had expired. Fighting wasn't going to change those facts. The settlement was finalized on December 15, 2024. I received the first payment, $1.8 million, on January 2, 2025. It was surreal seeing that much money hit my bank account. But the story didn't end there. In February, Detective Santos called me with an update on her investigation. Wait, we've found evidence of significant financial irregularities during Patricia Moreland's time as HOA president. She authorized payments to vendors owned by her husband without disclosing the conflict of interest. She also used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses disguised as community costs. We're talking about roughly $300,000 over 8 years. Can you prosecute? We're building a case. We've also found evidence that she orchestrated the harassment campaign against Eleanor Fairchild and other residents who opposed her. There are emails between her and 2 other former board members discussing ways to make life difficult for you and convince Eleanor to back off. We're pursuing charges for conspiracy, harassment, and embezzlement. In April 2025, Patricia Moreland was arrested at her home in Sunset Ridge. The charges included 6 counts of embezzlement, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit harassment, and 1 count of making terroristic threats. Gerald Hutchins was charged as an accomplice on 3 of the embezzlement counts. Susan Crawford cooperated with investigators in exchange for immunity. The trial took place in August 2025. I attended several days of testimony, watching as prosecutors laid out a pattern of abuse that went back nearly a decade. Patricia had treated the HOA as her personal bank account, funneling money to companies she and her husband controlled, approving unnecessary expenditures that benefited her friends, and using her position to punish anyone who questioned her authority. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On August 28th, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts against Patricia and 4 counts against Gerald. Patricia was sentenced to 6 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $312,000. Gerald received 3 years and a $100,000 restitution order. I was in the courtroom when the judge read the sentence. Patricia showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as bailiffs led her away in handcuffs. Her husband sat in the gallery, looking shell-shocked. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor met me on the steps. She looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her, some color back in her face. "It's over," she said. "Is it? How are things in the community?" "Better? Slowly. Some people are still angry about the increased fees, but property values have actually gone up since the settlement. Turns out having clear title to the land is good for real estate. Who knew?" She smiled. "What about you? What are you going to do with $18 million? "I haven't decided yet. Some of it will go to taxes, obviously. I'm thinking about using some to start a foundation that helps people fight HOA abuse. After going through this, I've learned how much power these organizations have and how little oversight they face." "That would be good. There are a lot of Patricia Morelands out there, and not enough people willing to stand up to them." We talked for a few more minutes, then said our goodbyes. As I walked to my car, I thought about the bizarre chain of events that had brought me here. A 99-year-old lease, an inheritance from a great aunt I barely knew, a community built on land that was never actually owned, and a woman so drunk on power that she destroyed her own life rather than admit she was wrong. The legal battle had taken over a year of my life. It had cost me sleep, money, and peace of mind. But it had also shown me something important about how communities work, how power corrupts, and how ordinary people can make a difference when they decide to stand up for what's right. I drove back to Flagstaff that evening, watching the sun set over the desert. Somewhere behind me, 200 families were living in homes built on land that now had clear title. They'd pay higher fees for the next decade, but their property was secure. Their community was free from the tyranny of a board president who'd treated them as subjects rather than neighbors. And I had enough money to never worry about work again, though I knew I'd keep appraising properties. I enjoyed the work, and I was good at it. But I'd also start that foundation, help other people trapped in disputes with overreaching HOAs, and maybe prevent the next Patricia Moreland from ruining lives. 3 months later, in November 2025, I attended the Sunset Ridge Estates holiday party at the clubhouse. Eleanor had invited me, insisting that despite everything, I should see the community at peace. The party was crowded, with families mingling around tables of food and a live band playing jazz standards. People approached me throughout the evening, some to thank me for settling rather than forcing sales of their homes, others to apologize for believing Patricia's lies. One couple in their 30s, Mark and Jennifer Hayes, pulled me aside near the punch bowl. "We wanted you to know," Jennifer said. "We were among the people who voted against the settlement. We believed Patricia when she said you were trying to scam us. We're sorry." "We just got scared," Mark added. "This is our first home. We have a 2-year-old daughter. The thought of losing everything just paralyzed us." "I understand," I said. "I never wanted to scare anyone. I'm just glad we found a solution that worked." "So are we," Jennifer said. "Our monthly fees are higher now, but we know where the money's going. The new board publishes detailed financial reports every month. It's amazing how much better things run when people aren't stealing from the community fund." Later, Eleanor and I stood on the clubhouse balcony, looking out over the community lights spreading across the desert. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Eleanor said. "Patricia could have settled this for almost nothing in the beginning. If she'd approached you in June 2024 with a reasonable offer before lawyers got involved, you probably would have taken far less than $18 million. Probably, I admitted. I didn't know what the land was worth. I didn't know anything about HOAs or community governance. If she'd offered me $2 or $3 million in a handshake, I likely would have said yes. Instead, her pride and need for control cost the community tens of millions and sent her to prison. There's a lesson in that. Several lessons, I said. We stood in comfortable silence, watching families enjoy the party below. Children ran between tables while parents laughed and talked. The band transitioned into a swing number, and couples moved onto the small dance floor. It looked like a normal community celebration, which I supposed it was. But I knew the history now. I knew what it had taken to get to this point: the fights, the threats, the legal battles, and ultimately the criminal prosecution of leaders who'd betrayed the people they were supposed to serve. In January 2026, I officially launched the Southwestern HOA Advocacy Foundation. The initial funding came from $2 million of my settlement money. The foundation's mission was to provide legal assistance, education, and advocacy for homeowners dealing with abusive HOA boards. We hired 3 attorneys, including Richard Chen, and set up offices in Phoenix, Tucson, and Flagstaff. Within the first month, we received over 300 requests for help from homeowners across Arizona, facing situations ranging from excessive fines to illegal foreclosures to outright fraud. One of our first major cases involved a retirement community in Mesa, where the HOA board had been systematically targeting elderly residents with fines and violations, then forcing sales of their homes when they couldn't pay. It was Patricia Moreland's playbook on an even larger scale. We won that case in April, securing a settlement that returned homes to 3 families and resulted in criminal charges against 2 board members. The local news covered the story extensively, and suddenly our foundation was fielding calls from across the Southwest. I hired Eleanor as a consultant. She was too old to want a full-time position, but she agreed to review cases and advise our attorneys on strategy. Her institutional knowledge of HOA operations proved invaluable. In May 2026, exactly 2 years after I'd first learned about the lease, I returned to Sunset Ridge for the annual meeting. I no longer owned the land. The settlement had transferred title to the HOA upon the first payment, but Eleanor had invited me to speak about our foundation's work. The turnout was impressive. Nearly 150 residents filled the clubhouse meeting room. I recognized many faces from the turbulent days of 2024. Though the atmosphere was completely different now. People were friendly, engaged, asking thoughtful questions rather than hurling accusations. I spoke for about 20 minutes, explaining how the foundation worked and the kinds of cases we handled. Several people asked questions about their own HOA issues, though most were minor compared to what Sunset Ridge had endured. After the formal meeting ended, a man in his 50s approached me. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, no relation to Richard, though they'd joked about it during the legal proceedings. "I moved here 6 months ago," Robert said. "I bought the Morelands house, actually. Patricia's husband sold it to cover legal bills and restitution payments." "How is it?" "The house? Beautiful. But I wanted to tell you something. When I was doing my due diligence before buying, my real estate agent warned me about the community's history. She suggested I look elsewhere because of all the drama, but I researched what actually happened, and you know what I found?" "What's that?" "I found a community that faced a crisis and came out stronger. I found homeowners who stood up to corruption and demanded accountability. I found a fair settlement that protected everyone's interests. This isn't a community to avoid. It's a model for how things should work." His words stayed with me as I drove home to Flagstaff that evening. The Sunset Ridge situation had started as a bizarre legal anomaly, a century-old lease expiring beneath a modern community. It had evolved into a battle against corruption and abuse of power. And it had ultimately transformed into something positive, a community rebuilt on transparency and fairness, and a foundation helping others facing similar fights. I thought about my great-aunt Margaret, who'd preserved that old lease document for decades and left it to me in her will. Had she known what it would lead to? Had she understood the value of what she was passing down? I'd never know. But I like to think she'd be proud of how things turned out. The foundation continued to grow. By the end of 2026, we'd handled over 800 cases and secured favorable outcomes in 70% of them. We'd helped pass new legislation in Arizona requiring greater financial transparency from HOA boards and establishing clearer procedures for homeowners to challenge unfair fines or rules. We had also expanded beyond Arizona, opening offices in Nevada and New Mexico, with plans for California and Texas in 2027. The need was enormous. Across the country, millions of people lived in HOA-governed communities, and while most HOAs operated fairly, the ones that didn't could destroy lives. In March 2027, I received an invitation to testify before a congressional committee examining HOA regulations and consumer protection. I flew to Washington and spent 3 hours answering questions about my experience with Sunset Ridge and the broader issues we'd identified through our foundation's work. The hearing didn't result in immediate legislation, but it raised awareness. Major news outlets picked up the story. Several states began examining their own HOA laws, and homeowners who'd felt powerless against abusive boards started to realize they had options. Eleanor passed away in her sleep in June 2027. She was 73. The memorial service was held at the Sunset Ridge Clubhouse, packed with residents who credited her with saving their community. I gave a eulogy, talking about her courage, her legal expertise, and her unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when it was difficult and dangerous. Eleanor understood something fundamental, I said, looking out at the assembled mourners. She understood that communities are built on trust, and when leaders betray that trust, ordinary people have to step up. She stepped up when it would have been easier and safer to stay quiet. Because of her, this community survived and thrived. Because of her, we built a foundation that's helped thousands of families. Her legacy will continue long after all of us are gone. We buried her in a cemetery overlooking the McDowell Mountains, not far from Sunset Ridge. Her headstone bore a simple inscription she'd chosen herself. She stood up. In the years that followed, I continued working with the foundation while gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations. We hired professional staff, expanded our legal team, and developed educational programs teaching homeowners about their rights and responsibilities. Sunset Ridge became a case study, featured in law school curricula and HOA management training programs as an example of both how badly things can go wrong and how communities can recover from even the worst governance failures. I stayed in touch with many of the residents I'd met during those turbulent months. Marcus Webb occasionally consulted for the foundation on financial investigations. Linda Kovach helped develop our educational materials. And dozens of others became advocates in their own right, helping neighbors understand their rights and pushing for accountability from their own HOA boards. The settlement payments continued like clockwork, arriving on the first of each month. I used most of the money to fund the foundation's expansion, but I kept enough to live comfortably and pursue my own interests. I bought a small ranch outside Flagstaff, spent more time hiking and exploring the landscapes I'd loved since childhood, and wrote a book about the Sunset Ridge experience that became a surprising bestseller. Patricia Moreland was released from prison in 2029 after serving 4 years of her 6-year sentence. I heard through the legal grapevine that she'd moved to a small town in Oregon and was working at a garden center. Her husband had divorced her during her incarceration. Her sons wanted nothing to do with her. I felt no satisfaction in her fall. She'd brought it on herself through arrogance, greed, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership meant. But watching anyone's life collapse, even someone who'd caused so much harm, wasn't something to celebrate. The ground lease that started everything became part of Arizona legal history. Law professors used it to teach about the importance of reviewing title documents and understanding the difference between surface rights and leasehold interests. Real estate professionals cited it as a cautionary tale about assumptions and due diligence. For me, it remained a reminder that sometimes life takes unexpected turns, and the most important thing is how you respond to them. I could have walked away when the HOA started fighting. I could have accepted a quick settlement and avoided all the drama and danger. But I'd believed in doing things the right way, in holding people accountable, and in fighting for what was right even when it was hard. That belief had cost me sleep, money, and peace of mind. It had also given me purpose, connected me with remarkable people like Eleanor, and created something that would help families for generations to come. As I sat on my ranch porch in the summer of 2030, watching the sunset over the San Francisco peaks, I thought about that registered letter that had arrived 6 years earlier. My great-aunt Margaret's final gift hadn't been the $18 million, though that was certainly life-changing. Her real gift had been an opportunity to make a difference, to stand up against corruption, and to build something meaningful from chaos. The 100-year lease had expired, but its impact would last far longer than anyone could have imagined when my great-grandfather first drafted those papers in 1925. That was the thing about real property, about land and the rights attached to it. The legal documents might yellow and crumble, but the consequences echoed forward through time, touching lives in ways impossible to predict. I'd learned that lesson well, and I'd spent the past 6 years making sure those echoes served justice rather than greed, accountability rather than abuse, and community rather than control. The ground beneath Sunset Ridge Estates belonged to its homeowners now, secure and unencumbered. Patricia Moreland was gone, her crimes punished and her victims compensated. The foundation continued its work across 5 states and growing. Sometimes I drove past the entrance to Sunset Ridge when I was in Scottsdale on business. The gates still bore that bronze lettering, the guardhouse still stood watch, and behind those walls, families lived their lives in homes that were finally, truly, theirs. I never stopped in anymore. That chapter was closed, but I always slowed down as I passed, remembering everything that had happened, everyone who'd fought for what was right, and the woman named Eleanor who'd stood up when it mattered most. The lease had expired, but the lesson would last forever.